Ask any Massachusetts parent about childcare, and they might break into a cold sweat. The Bay State has the highest childcare costs in the nation, estimated at $26,343 for an infant in full-time center-based care in 2024, and that fact is routinely cited as one of the biggest reasons that life here can feel unaffordable. One other state has chosen a different path. After a years-long process that involved a statewide vote to change its constitution, New Mexico now offers universal childcare by tapping into something called the Land Grant Permanent Fund, which is essentially funded by the oil and gas industry in New Mexico. The state subsidizes costs for virtually all families, regardless of how much they make. It's had a massive impact, swelling enrollment by the thousands and saving the average New Mexican family some $12,000 per year, while also exposing ongoing challenges with hiring enough workers to ensure there's a sufficient supply of childcare slots. So what can states like Massachusetts learn from New Mexico's example, both for ideas to adopt and pitfalls to avoid? I'm Chris Lisinski, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life in Massachusetts. This week, we try to answer that question. Today, we are not focused on Massachusetts per se. Instead, we're going to turn our eyes west toward the setting sun and look at New Mexico. My guest on today's episode of the Codcast is Jacob Vigil, the Chief Legislative Officer of New Mexico Voices for Children. It's a group that's advocated for the expansion of childcare funding and eligibility. Jacob, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we're about 8 months into this new reality, give or take, of universal childcare for all families, but I'm sure the history must stretch much further back. So how long was the process of getting to this November 1st start date, and how much work went into that behind the scenes?
So this effort really did begin over a decade and a half ago. The most recent announcement and policy achievement of universal childcare, we're certainly very excited about it and excited to see where it goes and how it improves the lives of New Mexico children and families. But really the effort began probably around 2009 when advocates got together and really put their heads together to try to figure out what was the next thing. What was a thing that our state could do to improve child well-being and poverty? We had long been at the bottom of a lot of lists and national rankings. I mean, my organization is the Kids Count organization in the state, so we curate the data that looks at different metrics of child well-being, and consistently, just New Mexico has really struggled there. So back at that time, the idea came about for a permanent, long-term funding source that could go to early childhood care and education. That resulted in a statewide coalition and a campaign that worked for years to get that measure passed in the state legislature so that it could go to the voters to approve a constitutional amendment for that additional funding through our state's Land Grant Permanent Fund. And along the way, it was a series of really significant sort of milestone victories that occurred during that time while we kept going back year after year, and that measure failed to pass in the legislature, right? So during that time, we were able to get another dedicated funding source created, the Early Childhood Trust Fund, which now largely funds childcare in our state. We created a dedicated early childhood care and education department, which housed all of the programs that are pertinent to early care and education, used federal COVID relief funding to expand childcare eligibility and eliminate copays. And then with the state sources of funding, we were able to seamlessly continue that. And so and then eventually that constitutional amendment did pass. 70% of the voters in 2022 approved that additional percentage to come out of the Land Grant Permanent Fund to fund early childhood care and education. So it's really a story of long-term trust-based coalition work, broad coalition work that reached out beyond the traditional early childhood advocacy ecosystem uh, an effort around communications, narrative building, community organizing, and then data driven advocacy, which is where my organization, my work have largely been focused. But yeah, and then so when the governor announced universal childcare last year, it was really the culmination of a lot of that work to help the public and policymakers understand why this is an economic development story, why this is about child development and education, health outcomes, and why this is something that we can really do to address sort of the widespread and systemic poverty that a lot of our children have grown up in.
70-30 is a pretty landslide vote, but tell me a little bit more about the political process to getting to that point. Who were the primary opponents of this pretty significant change in the status quo? And you also said that there was a lot of work to build a coalition. Who were some of the biggest supporters outside the traditional childcare advocacy world?
In those early years, as we were trying to get a joint resolution passed in the legislature, New Mexico has had for quite some time uh, Democratic control of the legislature, right? And so it wasn't sort of it wasn't a partisan issue per se. There were some really powerful Democrats in charge of finance committees, and really, I think the messaging or the belief there was that this land grant permanent fund, right, which was created with statehood, it's part of the Constitution. It has a very limited number of beneficiaries to which distribution can be made every year for funding, and those mostly are public education entities. And so it's this belief that if we tapped into that fund, if we took any more out of that fund, that it would damage the corpus of the fund. That it would make it that it would not be sustainable, right? And so um, I think like the oil and gas industry upon which that fund is really based, and that's where the wealth comes from, right? The balance of the fund grew significantly in recent years. I think it now sits. Um, Oh God, I don't want to say the wrong number, but it ballooned by billions of dollars in just the course of the campaign. And so it's this idea that that wealth should just sit there. It should be for a rainy day. And the proponents and advocates of this additional funding for early childhood were really trying to make the case, well, this is, if ever there was an emergency, if ever there was an urgent and critical use and time for that wealth, which is our state's wealth. It's the wealth of our people, the wealth of our land, which really was sort of locked up in the Constitution when we became a state because of really some reasons having to do with historical racism and that sort of are at the core of how and when New Mexico became a state. But this idea that the wealth of our state should be used for our most important resource, which is our children, right? Our children need this support now. It's something that will pay off long into the future, and it's something that will help develop our state out of poverty. And so that was that was sort of the core of the argument. And so champions, outside of traditional early childhood included immigrant rights organizations, workers' rights organizations, folks who do work in sort of civic engagement and democracy work, economic justice groups, right? Who really kind of understood that how the expansion of childcare and early education could really impact their communities, right? The communities found a stake in this. Different, like immigrant communities, for example, that largely really make up the workforce, to be honest, of childcare and a large part of the workforce, including in the oil and gas industry here, really saw this as a justice issue, as something that their communities could really benefit from, and the promise of the sort of potential for a thriving future that their children can and should have, right? So, and so because that coalition really became that broad sort of economic justice based coalition, I think we were able to leverage a lot more power, a lot more voices, and to be honest, that really the C4 work was a huge pillar of what the coalition was able to accomplish in terms of the electoral work and changing the complexion of the legislature, especially around 2018, 2020.
Mhm. Now, when we say universal child care, what do we really mean? What does that actually look like in New Mexico? Is a family that earns $30,000 per year getting the same subsidy, the same benefit, or the same level of benefit as a family earning $300,000 per year? Or is it more like universal access to some kind of benefit with different levels of benefits based on household income?
No, it's a great question. The short answer to that is yes. It's universal in the sense of no income requirements, right? So the wealthy families are getting the same access to the same benefit as all other families, right? And so, um, and there's a caveat to that, which I'll talk about, but that was the governor's vision, right? It was about universal. In this case, meant removing income eligibility barriers. And I'll remind folks that as of 2021, we actually had expanded all childcare, the eligibility for the subsidy to everyone up to 400% of the federal poverty level. That covered over 85% of New Mexicans already. So we were already most of the way there toward universal in that sense, everyone being eligible. What the most recent change did was just remove the remaining eligibility barriers for those above 400% of the federal poverty level. The bill that passed in this last session was sort of the bill that codified universal child care as we know it now, and that was signed into law. And so part of the compromise that was made there in order for the governor to get and the executive to get that funding to continue the program was that some guardrails were put in, right? So legislators and there definitely was some feeling and controversy around that, like why should this benefit go toward those on the high end of the income scale. I think the conversation around universality there is very interesting. I think we have some thoughts on that, on why and how that has been really effective in our case, like to make that sort of universally accessible. But the legislature was keen on putting some guardrails, and what that means is if the fiscal situation in our state changes and there's pressure on how and whether we can sustain the funding. If certain fiscal conditions kick in, then copays and wait lists will be reintroduced at the high end of the income scale in that case, right? And so those are sort of the reintroduction of copays and wait lists just for the highest end of the income scale. We haven't seen that yet because we haven't met those conditions, but that was part of the compromise that the legislature made in order to authorize the ongoing funding for the program.
Okay. So I want to stay focused on the family and the household side to start. I'll have some questions later about impacts on industry and on the state's financial ledger, but what can we say so far? Is it too early to get any quantifiable, clear, data-driven trends about the impact that universal childcare has had on New Mexico families?
I don't think it's too early to identify some quantitative trends, and I think that the department certainly has been tracking very closely the rise in number of children enrolled. So, and I think you can go to the department's website and fact check this. I believe we're at about 12,000 more slots or 12,000 more children enrolled than we were before November 1st. The number of providers, and I think that includes home based and center based, has increased by, I think, a couple hundred. So, in just the last several months, we definitely have made progress, right? And I think you can see that in just the stories of families from across the state, from across the income spectrum, who really and this gets to the heart of why this is such an important policy, and what we as children's advocates really are strongly behind it, is that that is an incredible boon to any family, right? We're talking about up to $12,000 annually, the cost of childcare, and so if that's something that families no longer have to worry about, what possibilities does that open up for them in terms of being able to make ends meet, being able to pursue other goals and financial stability. So that's definitely progress. So that's being tracked very closely. There's still ways to go, right? I mean, I think you'll see and hear, maybe we'll talk more about this, but the creating the demand overnight, right, with the stroke of a pen, did not mean that the supply was readily there and available. So that's sort of the current and ongoing task of the department and all the advocates and stakeholders who work with the department and policymakers to make sure that the care is available in the setting and in the location and in the way that that families need it.
An average of $12,000 saved per family really is huge, and I have to imagine that the flip side of that is quite a bit more public investment, quite a bit of subsidy that the state's picking up. So, what does that all mean for New Mexico's state budget? Is this now one of the single biggest areas of state spending?
Yeah, that's a great question. It certainly has become one of the larger pieces of investment in our state. My organization works a lot in budget policy. We track the budget very closely and how the state allocates resources. We now are sitting in a situation where 10% of our state budget goes to early care and education. That would have been unheard of even like 5 years ago. And so it certainly has become childcare in particular has become a really substantial source of spending. Um, I will say that one of the things that has made that more palatable for lawmakers, and I think that states across the country are asking me. I get asked all the time, "How did you do this? How can we do this in our state?" The fact is, New Mexico has a pretty unique fiscal situation right now, given that we're the second largest oil producing country in the state. And our state budget is heavily dependent on oil and gas revenue. And so, with the boom in production in the Permian Basin, which straddles Texas and New Mexico, that is what has really allowed this sort of inflows of revenue into our state budget that lawmakers very very wisely have stewarded into the form of permanent funds and trust funds, right? Like that funding has not gone out sort of like along the lines of Alaska in the form of like checks to individuals, but it's like it's sort of putting it away, making it a really sustainable and guarded source of revenue that the state can draw on for strategic purposes. And so the Early Childhood Trust Fund that was created in 2020 started at 300 million and now it sits at $11 billion. Just here 3 or 4 years later, and so that the trust fund is the sole source really of funding for childcare in our state. So I mean, the estimates vary. I think that we will have to continue to advocate for the continued funding and the sustaining of this program because costs surely will rise. As more people get online and as the cost of care, we also reimburse our providers at a very high rate. We reimburse providers according to the costs of care. We also want to make sure that wages and compensation for the workforce are improved, and there's lots of ways we're working on that. So surely this is and will continue to be a large part of the state budget.
hmm Could you just tell us a little bit more about what exactly the Land Grant Permanent Fund is? I know that dates all the way back to the Constitution itself, the state constitution. What is it? How is it originally envisioned, and how has it been changed to become such a central part of this child care vision?
Yeah. Well, I'll make the distinction between two fund. There's the Land Grant Permanent Fund and the Early Childhood Trust Fund, right? So the Land Grant Permanent Fund started with statehood. It gets its inflows from leases and royalties on state lands from mineral and oil production, and so royalties and leases on that production on state land go into that fund, and the beneficiaries only were able to get 5% of the annual average of the corpus of that fund for many years. The voters approved and what advocates fought for 10 years, and then the voters approved in 2022 was for an additional 1.25% to come out of that fund to go to early childhood care and education. So that additional 1.25% now goes to the early childhood care and education department, and that largely funds pre-K. So and to the tune of about 160 to 200 million a year. Now, in the course of the fight for that, a compromise that was made in 2020 from those lawmakers who continued to bar and block the land grant permanent fund effort. They created an early childhood trust fund in 2020. So that was kind of an effort to say, hey, we don't want you to get at the land grant permanent fund, but we'll create this other fund because they have a lot of revenue coming in. And that was created with a similar structure from oil and gas revenue. But little did folks know or anticipate at the time that that fund, the early childhood trust fund, would would increase dramatically in the next couple of years, and then that fund became the main source for childcare funding, right? So it's really the two. The two are working to fund different parts of our early childhood care and education system. But I would say that the trust fund would not have come about if it had not been for the advocates fighting for years for the land grant permanent fund, and along with lawmakers in compromises and negotiations, trying to come up with some solution to fund early care and education in our state. So eventually now we have both, right? And so we're really proud of that. But yeah, it's a distinction that's important, but not often uh, understood.
You know, as you look back, how important was it to get voter approval on the constitutional amendment, both mechanically and also politically? Would it have been possible, again, either literally in terms of the finances and statute or in terms of public support to get to where we are today if 70% of voters hadn't weighed in support?
Yeah, I think on both counts, we would not be where we are today, right? So on the very practical side, the sort of overwhelming support and sort of understanding among the public and policymakers about the importance of early care and education, securing that funding stream in particular was it was a watershed moment, right? It set it. I think it opened the horizons of possibility for what could happen after that, right? So we had a governor come in 2018 in the midst of that campaign before we had won any of those victories, who really prioritized and had it as her agenda to expand early care and education, right? But when voters approved the the measure 4 years into her term, or at the end of her first term, I think that what that said was that campaign was able to get not just an early childhood department established, another trust fund established, but when voters approved that, it said, there's power behind this, right? There's understanding of why this is important. That the governor and other policymakers could make bigger and bolder decisions, right? Which they did. I think, like using the ARPA COVID relief funds to expand eligibility to 400% was a huge another big piece of why she did not have to do that, right? Those funds could have been used for anything, but that was sort of a marquee uh, uh, step that led us to where we are today. And then on the other side of it, right? I think it really is that sort of like a critical mass uh, of sort of public understanding and political will that vote represented, and that now lawmakers, we can kind of take it for granted that like we won't run into lawmakers really on either side of the aisle who will stand up against spending on early care and education. It's we've kind of moved the goalposts, which isn't to say that there aren't challenges or nuances in that, right? But like I think that it was pretty resounding. So from the very practical, like fiscal and political side, all the way to the narrative and broader political perspective, it was pretty critical.
Jacob, you touched on this earlier, but one of the common criticisms that's circulating today is that supply has not kept up with the sudden explosion in credits available to families, subsidies available to families, that New Mexicans now have costs covered by the state, but might still struggle to find access because there just aren't enough slots to accommodate everyone who's newly looking. Is that the case? Has this solution to one problem exacerbated a different problem?
I would say it's put more urgency on that second problem, right? I don't. I don't think we're at a point where we're hearing that families are unable to get the care that they need broadly. I think that's probably different in rural areas, tribal areas. Certainly, the systemic sort of disparity in the availability of childcare continues, right? I mean, I think this is the case everywhere. Rural areas, tribal areas tend to just not have as many available slots, right? So that continues, and in order to make sure that all the promise of this policy is available to all New Mexicans, we're going to have to address that. And to the credit of the administration, the department, right? That's kind of their current focus. There's a big focus on the expansion of home-based providers, registered homes, because that's one of the ways in terms of infrastructure and supply to get that care that's needed and accessible to families. And there you have to grapple with the necessity to make sure that that care is high quality, that there's safe and healthy standards, safety and health standards, and adequate compensation, right? And which leads me to that issue of adequate compensation. I think if there was one sort of key issue that the supply hinges on, it's having a workforce that's stable and sees this as a viable career and a career path that can compensate them well, right? For too long, childcare workers in our state, in our country, have been earning poverty wages. You have childcare workers who are also on public benefits, and while we're telling them you need to get more and more credentials and degrees, and you are taking care of our most valuable um uh uh resource of the young children in our lives. You're building brains, you're educators, but if they are not compensated well, that turnover is going to remain high, which is bad for kids, bad for the field, when you're not able to form those bonds and to sustain those sort of adult child bonds, which are the foundation of early learning. So without addressing the compensation issue, I don't think we get very far. But that's certainly one of many concerns when it comes to the expansion of supply.
We haven't talked about Massachusetts all that much on this episode because we want to learn from another state, but any of our listeners will be sure to tell you that we have quite a lot of problems with childcare here, very limited slots, long wait lists, and some of the highest costs in the nation. Some studies put us at actually number one in childcare costs in the nation. But again, looking at the supply issue here, slots and wait lists, what levers are available for state governments to pull, whether it's in New Mexico or in Massachusetts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I'll say the wage and compensation issue here in New Mexico. We're working on a wage and career lattice, which I believe the folks in New York are also looking at, because that would, it would be sort of a comprehensive way of connecting the funding, the subsidy structure, and the funding and the reimbursement rate to the compensation of providers, right? And that would go up and down the scale from just an entry level teacher to a director, right? And so not tying the compensation to the reimbursement rate is ultimately kind of what that's trying to get at, so that there's not the compression issue when you raise the base wage, but those who have been in the field for a long time don't get a raise. And so that's one issue. I think we also have a low interest loan program for providers. Like the state has invested, I think it was about $10 million in loans that could get repaid by the state, but for providers to set up their businesses and their programs. I think capital and infrastructure is another one. I think we've started with some baby steps and trying to figure that out and get some funding for that, but I think that will be more and more imperative as policymakers start to see in their districts that we need to build and have that capacity. And I think technical assistance, everything from like the business side to help with licensing for providers and folks who want to come online, whether they're home based or center based. Um, that technical assistance is crucial. Usually, like, in our state, it's a combination of nonprofit, for-profit entities, provider associations who kind of work together and provide that assistance to folks. But the state could certainly use some of its resources to support all of those efforts, right? So, yeah, I think that's a start, and certainly it's crucial to have really good data. I think understanding and mapping like where the gaps in supply are, where those childcare deserts are, what solutions families are sort of turning to in their communities when there's sort of a lack of the care that they need. So like having a really robust data system here in New Mexico, we have uh, um, really good mapping of where those slots are, and then we can overlay that with what we call an early development index to overlay it with child outcomes. And then a newly released professional development information system that kind of tells you what are the contours of the workforce, how much are folks getting paid, where are they located, and so that data is really important in understanding where to allocate those resources for supply.
We're approaching the end of our time here, so where I want to close is asking you to rewind 15 years. Put yourself back in 2009, 2010, give or take, when you say that the real advocacy campaign first started. If you were there again, seeing how this has gone, is there anything you would do differently? Even if you think that it's been a success so far, are there any junctures where a different route might have proved even more successful?
Hmm. Yeah. Honestly, so on the fiscal side, because really it was a campaign around revenue, right? I would go bolder. I would go bigger and say, this should not just be limited to the land grant permanent fund. What else can we do? How can we look at the tax code, new sources of revenue? How can we channel oil and gas revenue into even other, like if we had started the Early Childhood Trust Fund even 2 or 3 years earlier, like, what would that have meant? How much more would we have had at our disposal? So yeah, I think dreaming big, being even more broad and creative when it comes to revenue. But also, and I've said this to other states, right? I think a lot of states are looking to us and asking questions. Um, and one thing New Mexico did right and had really down was just the organizing, right? The people power, the building of power through a broad-based grassroots, right? Like I think that was really strong. I would, if I could go back, I would have maybe us um within that coalition thinking a little bit more about the ins and outs of the policy and of implementation, right? So like if we I think we were so focused on getting the funding that we weren't necessarily thinking about, well, what if when we have a childcare subsidy system, what kind of changes could we make? If we had this sort of funding, how could we change the system structurally or introduce some, more different sort of policy initiatives or solutions that could improve access aside from the funding, right? And so I think having that solid policy analysis as part of a grassroots campaign so that you can come to the table with, okay, we want the funding, right? We fought for that, we deserve that, but here's how we see an ideal sort of childcare subsidy system being designed, right? That attends to the needs of diverse families in diverse parts of the state, the workers, right? What compensation could look like. So I think states now have the opportunity to do that, to learn from us and to learn from the advocates and organizers and educators and families in their own state about what, if we were to build an amazing childcare system from scratch and get the funding to do that and make it available for families, what would that look like?
Jacob Vigil, Chief Legislative Officer of New Mexico Voices for Children, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. This has been a really fascinating and illuminating discussion.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Thanks again to Jacob Vigil for joining me on the podcast, and thanks to you for listening. I'm Chris Lisinski. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Cazzello. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us. And email us at codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back next week.